You buried her 3 hours ago, old man. You don't get to own anything anymore. My son said those words to me in the parking lot of Restwood Funeral Home, standing beside the black car that was supposed to take us both home. He didn't whisper it. He said it flat, like he was reading a grocery list, while 3 of his coworkers stood 20 feet away, pretending not to hear. Nobody moved. Somewhere behind us, a car door was still open, and the little electronic chime kept sounding over and over into the silence. Ding, 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 because nobody had bothered to close it. Nobody breathed. I stood there in my one good black suit, my wife's casket not yet 6 feet under the ground, and I watched my son's face and understood in that single frozen second that I had spent 40 years mistaking a man's silence for his gratitude. A house does not know it has been sold out from under it until the moving truck is already in the driveway. Neither did I. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. And if you've ever poured your whole life into a family that decided, the moment you looked weak, that you were worth throwing away, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. My name is Frank Doyle. I am 63 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a title examiner for Meridian Title and Abstract, a small firm 2 towns over from where I grew up. If you don't know what a title examiner does, it's simple. Before anyone in this county buys a piece of land or a house, somebody has to go back through the paper trail. Sometimes 80, 100 years of deeds, liens, easements, judgments, and make absolutely certain that the person selling actually has the legal right to sell it. People think real estate is about money. It isn't. It's about paper. Whoever controls the paper controls the property, no matter what the porch light looks like or whose name is on the mailbox. I learned that lesson before I learned how to shave properly, and it kept a roof over my family's head for 3 decades. I just never imagined I'd need it to protect that roof from my own son. I gave that man everything I had to give. 22 years of Little League practices I never missed, even the ones on nights I'd been on my feet at the courthouse annex since 6 in the morning. $11,000 of my own retirement savings pulled out early, penalties and all, to cover his tuition the semester he flunked out of the state school and needed a second chance nobody else was offering him. 3 times, 3 separate times over the years, I co-signed loans for businesses that failed within 18 months, and 3 times I quietly paid off what he couldn't. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I am telling you because on the day my wife died, all of that arithmetic came due at once, and the answer it gave me broke something in my chest that I did not know could break. Eleanor and I bought our house on Larkspur Lane the year Gary was born. It was a modest 2-story with a wrap-around porch, nothing fancy. The kind of house you could raise a family in and grow old in without ever needing to explain yourself to anybody. Eleanor filled that porch with hanging ferns every spring for 40 years. She died on a Tuesday in March, quietly. In the bedroom we'd shared since 1991, with my hand in hers and the porch light on outside, because she always said she liked to fall asleep knowing it was lit. I want you to understand something about grief before I go further into this story, because it matters to everything that comes after. Grief does not make a man weak in the way people assume. It does not make him foolish or careless with his affairs. What it does is make him quiet. It hollows out the part of you that used to argue, used to push back, used to notice when something felt wrong. For 11 days after Eleanor died, I barely spoke above a whisper. I could not walk into our kitchen without my hands beginning to shake, because her yellow kettle still sat on the back burner exactly where she'd left it. And some mornings I would stand in that doorway for 10 full minutes just staring at it, unable to make myself go in and make coffee in a kitchen that no longer smelled like her. That is not weakness. That is love with nowhere left to go. But my son and his wife read it as something else entirely. They read it as an opening. I need to tell you about Renee because you cannot understand what happened to me without understanding her first. My son Gary married Renee Castellano 9 years ago, and from the very first Thanksgiving, I watched her study our family the way I used to study a stack of old deeds, looking for the gap, the missing signature, the place where the paper trail went soft. She was polished and warm in a way that made you feel foolish for distrusting her, right up until you caught her doing quiet arithmetic behind her eyes while she smiled at you over the dinner table. Eleanor saw it before I did. Eleanor always saw things before I did. 2 years before she passed, my wife took my hand in the car after a family dinner and said very softly, "Frank, that girl is planning something. I don't know what yet. But she's planning it." I told her she was imagining things. I have spent every day since regretting that I did not listen to my wife the first time she was right about our son's marriage, because she was right about almost everything else too. Here is the piece of the story that matters most, the piece that decides everything that happens later, so I want to lay it out plainly. 19 years ago, on the advice of my accountant, Eleanor and I transferred the deed to our house on Larkspur Lane into Gary's name for estate planning purposes, a common enough maneuver meant to shield the property from certain future tax burdens. But I did not hand my son a house free and clear, and I never told him otherwise, because at the time I did not entirely trust what he might do with it. I had already watched him burn through 2 failed businesses and 1 questionable circle of friends. So when I filed that deed at the county recorder's office, I filed something else alongside it, a reserved life estate, in Eleanor's name and mine, recorded on the same page, in the same instrument. In plain English, it meant this: Gary's name was on the deed, yes, but the right to live in that house, to control it, to decide what happened to it, that right belonged entirely to Eleanor and me, for as long as either of us was alive. Gary held what the law calls a remainder interest. He would not actually own the house, not really, not in any way he could act on, until both of his parents were gone. I told him at the time that it was just some paperwork the lawyer wanted on file. I did not lie to protect myself. I lied because some part of me already understood, even then, that if my son ever needed money badly enough, he might not wait for nature to take its course. I am not proud of that instinct. I am only grateful now that I trusted it. Gary never read that instrument. I would bet everything I have left that he never once, in 19 years, pulled the recorded deed and actually looked at what it said. Why would he? His father worked in title examination his whole life. His father handled the paperwork. That was simply how things were done in our family. I did the paper, Eleanor did the porch ferns, and Gary did whatever it was Gary did, which mostly involved needing things from us and then resenting us slightly for having them to give. 3 days after Eleanor's funeral, before I had even worked up the courage to walk back into our kitchen and make myself a full pot of coffee, I got a phone call from a man I had never met, a real estate attorney named Preston Hale, representing a young couple named the Ferraros. He was calling, he said, because his clients had just closed on a purchase of a property at 14 Larkspur Lane, my house, and during a routine final title sweep before recording, his own examiner had flagged an anomaly, a life estate reserved and recorded 19 years earlier, still active, still valid, belonging to one Frank and Eleanor Doyle. Mr. Hale wanted to know, politely, professionally, whether I might be willing to discuss resolving the discrepancy, because as things stood, his clients had just paid $410,000 for a house they legally could not yet possess. I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long moment after that call ended, looking at Eleanor's yellow kettle on the back burner, and for the first time in 11 days my hands were not shaking. They were steady, perfectly, coldly steady. Because here is what I understood in that instant, the thing my son and his wife never once considered in their hurry, to cash in before my grief could clear enough for me to notice. I had not lost my house. My house had never, for one single day of those 19 years, belonged to anyone but me. I want to take you back 3 days, though, to the moment I actually found out what Gary had done. Because I did not learn it from a lawyer's phone call. I learned it the same afternoon of my wife's funeral, standing in that parking lot, watching a moving company van pull away from Larkspur Lane while I was still wearing the black tie I'd worn to bury her. We had driven straight from the cemetery to the reception at the church hall, the way you're supposed to, the way Eleanor would have wanted, casseroles and folding chairs and people telling me she was in a better place now. I left early. I told Gary I needed air, and I drove the 6 minutes back to Larkspur Lane because some instinct in me, some grief-soaked animal instinct, needed to sit on that porch, in the ferns Eleanor had hung that spring, and just breathe for a while before I had to be a functioning person again for the rest of the day. I came around the corner of our street and saw a moving truck backed halfway up our driveway, its rear doors thrown open. Two men in gray uniforms carrying Eleanor's reading chair, the wingback with the faded floral upholstery she'd had reupholstered twice rather than replace. Down the porch steps and into the truck bed like it was nothing, like it was furniture. I parked crooked at the curb. I don't remember getting out of the car. I remember standing on my own front walk in my funeral suit, watching strangers carry my dead wife's chair past me, and a young woman with a clipboard. Renee had hired an estate liquidation company, I would learn later, a company that specialized in exactly this, fast turnaround sales for families who needed cash quickly. Asked me, not unkindly, if I was there for the walkthrough. That was when Gary arrived. He must have followed me from the church hall, because his car pulled in behind mine only a minute later, and he came up the walk fast, already talking before he'd even reached me, already explaining, the way people explain when they know, somewhere underneath the words, that no explanation is going to be good enough. He told me the house needed to be sold. He told me the market was hot right now and wouldn't stay that way. He told me Mom would have wanted him to be practical. He used the word practical 3 times in about 90 seconds, and every time he said it, I watched Renee, standing a few feet behind him near her car, check her phone and say absolutely nothing. I asked him one question. I asked him whose name was on the deed, and that is when he said it. Standing in the driveway of the house his mother had died in 3 days earlier, with her reading chair already loaded into a stranger's truck, my son looked at me and said the words that started this whole reckoning. "You buried her 3 hours ago, old man. You don't get to own anything anymore." I did not argue with him in that driveway. I did not raise my voice and I did not cry, though God knows I wanted to. I have spent my entire professional life learning that the worst thing a man can do when he discovers a fatal flaw in someone else's paperwork is announce it too early. You let them finish signing. You let them believe the deal is done. And then, when they are standing at the closing table, certain of their victory, you show them the one page they never bothered to read. I got back in my car. I drove myself home to an empty condo I'd kept from years earlier as a rental property, the only roof I had left that night, and I sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I began very calmly, very methodically, to write down everything I remembered about the instrument I had recorded 19 years before. My hands, for the first time since Eleanor died, were not shaking at all. I did not sleep that night. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of a condo that smelled like nobody, I understood something with total clarity. My son believed he had just gotten away with something. He believed his grief-stricken father was too broken to notice, too old to fight, too soft after 40 years of giving to ever turn around and take something back. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He had no idea that the man he'd just discarded on a curb in a funeral suit was the one person in this entire county who had spent 31 years learning exactly how to read the fine print that ruins people. I closed my eyes that night and let him believe he'd won. Because a man who believes he's already won never bothers to look behind him. And that is exactly where I intended to be standing. The morning after Eleanor's chair disappeared into a stranger's truck, I woke up at 5:40, out of habit more than intention, in a condo that still had moving boxes stacked against one wall from a tenant who'd left 8 months earlier. I made coffee in a pot that wasn't Eleanor's, in a kitchen that wasn't ours, and I sat at a table that had never known either of us, and I called the only man in this county I trusted more than my own blood. Marcus Webb and I started at Meridian Title on the same week in 1994, 2 young men in cheap ties learning to read microfiche until our eyes ached. He'd left the examination side years back to become a real estate attorney, but he still kept his license current with the county bar, still remembered every abstract we'd ever pulled together back when we were young enough to think the work was tedious rather than sacred. Marcus answered on the second ring, the way old friends do when they can hear in your silence, before you've said a word, that something has gone wrong. I told him everything. The funeral. The truck in the driveway, Eleanor's chair, what Gary had said to me on the walk. Marcus didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line, and then he asked me a single question in the flat, careful voice he used to use when he was about to tell a client something they didn't want to hear. Frank, the Larkspur Lane transfer back in '06. Did you file the reservation as a separate instrument or endorse it directly onto the deed? I told him I'd recorded it as a rider, attached to and incorporated into the same instrument, filed the same afternoon, same book and page. I remembered because I had walked it to the recorder's window myself, on my lunch break, the same week Gary had asked to borrow $4,000 for a car he'd total within the year. Marcus exhaled slowly. Then it's good, Frank. It's clean. If it's recorded and incorporated the way you're describing, it survived. Doesn't matter whose name shows up first on the grantee line. A life estate reservation runs with the land. Your son could sell that property to the King of England with 100 witnesses and a marching band, and it wouldn't matter one bit, because he never had fee simple to convey in the first place. All he had was a remainder. You can't sell what you don't yet own. I sat with that sentence for a long moment, staring at the steam rising off a coffee mug in a kitchen that smelled like nothing, like nobody, like a house with no ferns hanging from the porch. 31 years of reading other people's mistakes on paper, and it turned out the most important document of my life was one I had written myself 19 years earlier, out of nothing but a quiet, unspoken distrust I'd never had the courage to say out loud to my own son. What do you want to do? Marcus asked me. Not what should you do? What do you want to do? He knew me well enough to understand those were two very different questions. I told him I wanted to see how far Gary would let this go before the truth caught up with him. I did not want to call him that morning and end it with a single phone call and a citation number. I wanted, and I am not proud of this, but I promised you the truth of this story, so here it is. I wanted him to feel for a little while exactly what it feels like to believe you have gotten away with something. I wanted him to sign the closing papers. I wanted him to spend the money in his head before I took it back, because a man who has never once, in his adult life, faced a real consequence does not learn from being stopped early. He only learns from watching the floor open up beneath him after he's already celebrating. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the voice of a man who had watched me bury my wife 3 days earlier and understood exactly what kind of grief could curdle into this particular kind of patience. All right, Frank, I'll help you build the file. Quietly, legally. Every piece of it clean so that when this comes apart, nobody can say you did anything but protect what was always yours. That was the moment the war actually began, not in the driveway, not with the shouting. It began in a borrowed kitchen at 6 in the morning, with two old men who spent their careers reading fine print, deciding to let a fool believe he'd won. I need to pause the story here and tell you about the part of this I am least proud of, because I promised you honesty and I intend to keep that promise even where it makes me look small. For 11 days after that phone call with Marcus, I did not return a single one of my son's calls. He phoned me 19 times in the first 4 days alone. I know the number because I wrote it down, the way I write everything down, an old habit from 31 years of documentation that apparently does not turn off just because the subject is your own child. I let every single call go to voicemail. And on the 5th night, alone in that borrowed condo with the television on for noise rather than company, I found myself standing in the small galley kitchen at nearly midnight, unable to make myself walk the 4 steps to the refrigerator because, for one disorienting moment, I had forgotten I wasn't in my own house, and some old animal part of my brain expected to see Eleanor's kettle on the back burner, and when it wasn't there, I stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, gripping the frame with one hand, unable to move forward or back. I am a man who spent his whole life being the person other people leaned on. I had never once, not in 63 years, let anyone see me unable to walk across my own kitchen. I did not let anyone see it that night either. But I want you to know it happened, because the version of me that later stood in front of a crowd and did what I did was not a man who felt nothing. He was a man who had simply run out of softer places to put the pain, and had begun, very quietly, converting it into something with an edge. My granddaughter called on the 6th day. Chloe is 19, a sophomore at the state university, the only person in my son's household who had never once, in her whole life, asked me for anything. She called from her dorm room, her voice tight and careful in the way of a kid who has learned to read a room from a very early age, and she asked me, point blank, whether it was true that her parents had sold my house. I did not lie to her. I told her yes, they had tried. I did not tell her about the life estate, not yet, not because I didn't trust her, but because I understood something about my granddaughter that her own parents seemed to have forgotten. Chloe was still a child in some ways, still learning how much weight she could carry, and I was not going to hand her the full shape of this war until I knew she could stand under it. But she told me something that afternoon that shifted everything I thought I understood about what had happened in that driveway. She told me her mother had been on the phone almost constantly for the past 2 weeks, in the garage, with the door shut, talking in a voice Chloe had never heard her use before, low, urgent, sometimes crying, to someone Chloe didn't recognize. She told me that 3 days before the funeral, before Eleanor had even passed, she'd walked into the kitchen and found her mother's laptop open to a listing for a condominium in another state, alone, no mention of Gary anywhere on the page. She told me her father had been drinking more than usual, and that twice in the past month she'd heard her parents fighting behind closed doors about something her mother kept calling my exit, a phrase that meant nothing to Chloe, but that had lodged itself, uneasy and half-formed, somewhere in the back of her mind. I sat very still on the edge of the bed in that borrowed condo, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something cold settle into place. I had assumed that first terrible day in the driveway that I was watching my son and his wife act as a single unit, two people united in their hurry to cash in on my grief. I understood now that I had been wrong about that, in a way that mattered enormously. I did not chase that thread that day. I let it sit. But I wrote it down on the legal pad Marcus had told me to keep, in the same careful handwriting I'd used for 31 years of title reports, and I underlined it twice. Before I go further, I want to explain, briefly and plainly, what actually happens when a house gets sold with a defect like the one sitting in my son's deed, because it matters to everything that comes next, and I promise I'll keep this short. When a buyer purchases real estate, their lender requires title insurance, and no title insurer will issue a policy on a property with an unresolved life estate held by someone still living, because that life estate holder retains the legal right to possess and control the property until they die, meaning the new owners could, in theory, show up with a moving truck and find the previous life tenant still living in the house, with every legal right to stay there. The Ferraros' closing had gone through only because a junior examiner at their title company had, in the rush of a fast transaction, initially misread my reservation as expired. A boilerplate clause elsewhere in the file used similar language for an unrelated easement that had lapsed after 20 years. And in the crush of closing week, someone had confused the two. It was Marcus's own careful eye, reviewing the file as a courtesy days later, that caught what a hurried, overworked examiner had missed. That is the entire mechanism. It is not complicated. It is simply the difference between a man who reads every line and people who were in too much of a hurry to spend somebody else's grief before it went cold. Marcus called me back 4 days after that from his own office with a folder he'd assembled entirely from what he called clean sources. Public county records anyone could pull, the original recorded instrument from 19 years earlier bearing both my signature and Eleanor's, and, most damning of all, a copy of the disclosure paperwork Gary himself had signed at closing, in which he'd sworn, under penalty of perjury, that he held clear and marketable title to the property, free of any outstanding interest. Marcus hadn't hacked anything, hadn't pulled a single private record he wasn't entitled to see. Everything in that folder was either a matter of public record or a document my son had signed with his own hand, certifying a fact he either knew to be false or had simply never bothered to check. There was one more piece, and this one came not from Marcus but from an old friend of mine named Ruth Castellano, Renee's own aunt, as it happened. a woman I'd known socially for years through the County Historical Society, long before I ever knew she was connected to my son's marriage at all. Ruth called me, unprompted, the week after the funeral, simply to offer condolences, having heard about Eleanor from a mutual friend. In the course of that conversation, gently, without my asking a single leading question, she mentioned that Renee had confided in her months earlier about financial pressure in the marriage, about a business Gary had quietly mortgaged the family finances into without fully disclosing the risk, and about Renee's own growing frustration that she had, in her words, given up 10 years to a man who can't get out of his own way. Ruth had no idea when she told me this, that she was handing me the second half of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was assembling. I never asked her a single improper question. I simply listened, the way I'd spent 31 years listening to what documents did and did not say, and I understood, by the time we hung up, that my son was not the architect of what had happened to me. He was, in the truest and saddest sense of the word, the last person in that marriage to find out what his own wife had already decided to do. I sat with the full folder Marcus had built, spread out on the kitchen table of that condo late one night, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in the middle of all this fury: pity, not enough to stop what I had already set in motion, but enough to understand, with a clarity that made my chest ache in a way grief hadn't managed to in weeks, that my son was not merely a man who had betrayed his father in a driveway. He was also, without knowing it yet, a man about to be betrayed by the one person he'd trusted enough to let make every important decisions in his life for the past 9 years. I want to tell you about the one moment, in the middle of all that cold calculation, where I let myself be soft because I think it matters and because I don't want you walking away from this story believing I am a harder man than I actually am. Chloe drove up from campus the following weekend, unannounced, and found me sitting alone on a bench outside that condo building, staring at nothing in particular, the folder from Marcus still in my lap. She didn't say anything clever. She didn't ask me what I was planning. She just sat down next to me, put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was 7 years old and scared of thunderstorms, and after a long silence she said, "Grandpa, I miss Grandma so much I can't breathe sometimes." And I put my arm around my granddaughter, and for the first time since I'd stood frozen in that borrowed kitchen doorway, unable to reach the refrigerator, I let myself cry, right there on that bench, in front of the one person in my family who had never once asked me for anything I couldn't afford to give. "I miss her too," I told her, every single day. We sat there for a long time after that, not talking, just two people who had loved the same woman, holding on to each other in the cold. It was the only unguarded hour I allowed myself in the entire 11 days between the funeral and what came next. I want you to remember that hour, because everything I did after it, everything cold and precise and unforgiving that follows in this story, came from a man who had already done his grieving properly, in the open, with someone who loved him. What came next was not born from a broken man lashing out. It was born from a man who had allowed himself to be fully, completely human, and had then decided, with total clarity, exactly what justice was going to look like. 3 weeks after the funeral, I finally called my son back. I did not tell him about the life estate. I did not tell him about Marcus, or the folder, or what Ruth Castellano had told me about her niece's laptop and her plans for an exit. I simply told him, in a calm, even voice that gave nothing away, that I understood the house needed to be dealt with, and that I would like to meet, the two of us, along with Renee, to discuss finalizing things properly. This coming Saturday, at the Memorial Garden dedication the Historical Society was hosting in Eleanor's honor. Gary sounded relieved when I said it. Relieved, and a little smug, in a way he probably didn't even realize was audible over the phone. He told me it was good to hear I was finally being reasonable about all this. I told him I would see him Saturday. Then I hung up the phone, sat alone in that quiet condo, and began, for the first time since the day I buried my wife, to smile. The Larkspur County Historical Society had been planning the Memorial Garden dedication for months before Eleanor died, though none of us knew, back when the planning started, that it would end up being held in her honor at all. Eleanor had served on their board for 11 years, had personally raised the money for the restoration of the old Whitfield Chapel Gardens downtown, and when she passed, the society's president, a soft-spoken woman named Diane Fassbinder, who had known Eleanor since before I did, called me personally to ask whether the society could rename the completed garden after her. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Saturday came bright and cold, the kind of crisp March morning that makes the whole world look freshly washed. The garden sat behind the old chapel downtown, restored brick walkways winding between beds that would, come summer, be full of the same kind of hanging ferns Eleanor used to grow on our porch. Diane had made sure of that detail herself. A crowd had gathered, close to 150 people, friends from the Historical Society, neighbors from Larkspur Lane going back 3 decades, 2 former mayors, a handful of people from Meridian Title who remembered Eleanor bringing me lunch on slow Fridays. A small stage had been set up near the new bronze plaque, still covered with a white cloth, waiting to be unveiled. I arrived early, in a gray suit rather than a black one, because I had decided, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that I was done wearing the color of mourning to events where I intended to fight. Marcus arrived with me, carrying a slim leather portfolio that held everything we needed and nothing more. Chloe arrived separately, sitting with a few of her old high school friends near the front, unaware of what her grandfather had planned, because I had made a decision, in the days before, that she should not have to carry the weight of watching it unfold as a participant. She would only have to watch it as a witness. That felt like the kindest thing I could offer her. Gary and Renee arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony began, dressed carefully, performing grief in the particular way people perform it when they believe the hardest part is already behind them. Gary shook my hand in front of several people from the Historical Society and told them, loudly enough to be overheard, how much this garden would have meant to his mother. Renee stood beside him in a charcoal dress, composed, watchful, her eyes moving across the crowd the way I imagined mine used to move across a stack of deeds, looking for the thing that didn't quite fit. I wondered, watching her, whether some part of her already sensed that something in this gathering was not what it appeared to be. Dion began the ceremony a little after 11, speaking warmly about Eleanor's years of service, about the chapel gardens, about the kind of quiet generosity that doesn't announce itself but changes a community anyway. She invited me up to say a few words before the plaque was unveiled, as Eleanor's husband, as was only right. I want to tell you honestly that I had not written a speech. I had written something else entirely, and Marcus knew what it was, and Chloe did not, and my son and his wife, standing in the front row, with their hands folded and their faces arranged into the appropriate expressions, had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them in front of 150 of our neighbors. I walked up to that small stage and stood behind the microphone, and I looked out at the crowd for a long moment before I spoke, the way I used to pause before delivering bad news to a client whose closing had just fallen through over a title defect nobody had caught in time. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "Eleanor would have hated all this fuss, and she would have loved it anyway, because that was who she was. She pretended not to want attention while quietly making sure everyone around her got exactly the care they needed." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, the kind of laughter that comes easily at a memorial when the person being remembered was genuinely loved. "I want to tell you a little bit about the house Eleanor and I built our life in," I continued, and I felt, rather than saw, Gary shift slightly in the front row. 40 years ago, we bought a house on Larkspur Lane with a wraparound porch, and every spring for 4 decades, Eleanor filled that porch with ferns. It was the only home either of us ever wanted. It is where we raised our son. It is where Eleanor took her last breath 3 weeks ago, with my hand in hers and the porch light on, because she liked to fall asleep knowing it was lit. I let that sentence sit in the cold morning air for a moment. Renee had gone very still. 3 days after I buried my wife, I said, and here my voice did not rise, did not shake, stayed perfectly level in a way I had practiced alone in a borrowed condo for 3 weeks. I came home from her funeral reception to find a moving truck in the driveway, carrying away her furniture, piece by piece, because my son had sold our house. A murmur moved through the crowd, uneasy, uncertain whether this was still part of the eulogy or something else entirely. I watched several people from the Historical Society turn to look at Gary, whose face had gone the color of old paper. "I want to be very clear," I said, "that I am not telling you this to humiliate my son in public, though I understand it may feel that way to him right now. I am telling you this because Eleanor spent 11 years on this board fighting quietly and persistently for something she believed in deeply, protecting older people in this county from exactly the kind of exploitation that happened to me in my own driveway 3 days after her funeral. And I think she would want me to say, out loud, in front of the community she loved, that it is never too late for the people who are supposed to protect you to instead become the people you need protecting from." Gary had started to move, half rising from his seat, and I saw Marcus, standing quietly at the edge of the stage, give him a look that stopped him mid-motion. Not a threatening look, simply the look of a lawyer who knows exactly how much worse this could get if Gary chose to make a scene in front of 150 witnesses. "My son believed," I said, turning to look at him directly now, my voice still even, still calm, "that because his name appeared on our deed, the house belonged to him outright, free to sell however and whenever he chose. He was wrong. 19 years ago, when Eleanor and I transferred that property for estate planning purposes, we recorded a life estate reserved in both of our names, a legal right, on public record at the county courthouse this entire time, giving us sole control of that house for as long as either of us drew breath. My son's name on that deed was never a promise of ownership while we lived. It was a promise of what would come to him after we were both gone, if he'd simply had the patience and the decency to wait." The murmur in the crowd had turned into something closer to a collective held breath. I could see in the front row an older woman I recognized from the Historical Society board reach over and quietly take Diane's hand. "The sale my son arranged 3 weeks ago," I continued, "was never valid. It could never have been valid. The buyers, a young couple who paid $410,000 in good faith for a home they believed was rightfully for sale, are currently working with their own attorney to unwind that transaction and recover every dollar they're owed, plus damages, because they did nothing wrong here except trust the wrong people. My son signed a sworn statement at that closing attesting that he held clear and marketable title to that property. He did not. Whether he lied deliberately or simply never bothered to read a document his own father filed 19 years ago is a question I will leave for him to answer to himself for the rest of his life." I paused there and I looked not at Gary but at Renee, standing very still beside him, her composed expression finally beginning to crack at the edges. "There is one more thing I need to say," I told the crowd, "and it is the hardest thing I've had to say in this entire ordeal. I do not believe my son acted alone in this. I do not believe he was even fully in control of what happened. I have learned in the past 3 weeks that there were conversations happening in my son's own home about an exit, about a condominium in another state, about a marriage already quietly ending, that he may not have been fully aware of when he agreed to a sale that was, above all else, extremely convenient timing for someone who needed to disappear with cash in hand before that marriage's own finances came apart." Renee's face went white. Gary turned to look at her, slowly. The way a man turns when a floor he thought was solid has just given way beneath him for the second time in the same morning. I want to pause the story here and tell you plainly what happened next, because it unfolded fast, and it unfolded in front of everyone, and I have never in my life watched two people destroy each other so completely, so publicly, in under 90 seconds. Gary turned to his wife and asked her, his voice cracking, whether it was true, whether there was money already moved somewhere, whether there was a condo. Renee did not deny it. She did something worse. She looked at him with an expression of pure, exhausted contempt and said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear clearly, that she had been planning her exit for over a year, that Gary's failed business had drained accounts she'd spent a decade building, and that the only reason she'd pushed so hard for the house sale the week of his mother's funeral was that it was the last liquid asset either of them had left before she walked away, and took what remained of her own money with her. The crowd had gone completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard Diane Fassbinder let out a small, involuntary gasp. Gary stood frozen in the front row of his own mother's memorial garden dedication, having just publicly discovered, in the space of 90 seconds, that his father still legally owned the house he'd tried to sell, that the sale itself was void, that a young couple he'd defrauded was preparing to sue him, and that his own wife had been planning to leave him with whatever cash she could extract for over a year, using his mother's funeral as cover to do it. I did not feel triumph in that moment. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. I felt something closer to grief, a fresh grief, laid directly on top of the old one, for the son I had raised, who had somehow become a man capable of standing in a driveway and telling his father he didn't get to own anything anymore, 3 hours after burying his mother. But underneath that grief, quiet and steady, was something else. Something that felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, very close to peace, because the truth had finally caught up with both of them in front of the one community that had loved my wife enough to build her a garden. And I had not needed to raise my voice a single time to make it happen. The garden dedication did not end the way ceremonies are supposed to end. Diane Fassbinder, to her enormous credit, did not try to salvage the schedule or usher everyone politely back to the unveiling as if nothing had happened. She stepped up beside me at the microphone, put a steadying hand briefly on my shoulder, and simply said, quietly but clearly, that the society would proceed with the plaque unveiling in a few minutes, and that in the meantime, perhaps everyone could take a moment to breathe. It was, I think, the kindest thing anyone did for me that entire morning. She gave the crowd permission to feel the weight of what they'd just witnessed instead of pretending it away. Gary and Renee did not stay to hear it. Gary walked, stiff-legged and pale, back through the crowd toward the parking lot, and Renee followed several paces behind him, not beside him. I noticed that, even in the chaos of the moment, that small detail, they were no longer walking as a couple. They were two people leaving the same disaster from opposite directions. I did not go after either of them. I stood on that small stage for a moment longer, looking out at 150 faces that had just watched my family come apart in public, and I felt, more than anything, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with anger. It was an older man near the back of the crowd who moved first. Harold Weiss, a retired postal carrier who'd delivered mail on our street for 26 years before he retired, stood up from his folding chair, walked forward without a word, and simply stood beside me on the edge of that small stage. Facing the crowd, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. A moment later, 2 more people from the Historical Society board rose and did the same, and then Ruth Castellano, Renee's own aunt, who had unknowingly handed me half the truth weeks earlier, walked up and stood on my other side, her face tight with something that looked like shame on her niece's behalf, and love for me anyway. Within a minute, there were 9 or 10 people standing quietly around me on that stage, not speaking, not performing anything for the crowd. Simply standing the way people stand beside a man at a graveside when words have run out of use. Nobody had asked them to. I hadn't expected it, and I found I couldn't speak for a moment, because I had spent 31 years being the man other people leaned on, and I had forgotten, somewhere in the loneliness of the past 3 weeks, what it felt like to have a community lean back. It was a child's voice that broke the silence, in the way children's voices always seem to arrive exactly when adults have run out of anything useful to say. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, the granddaughter of one of the Historical Society members, tugged on her mother's sleeve in the 3rd row and asked, in the clear, carrying voice children use when they haven't yet learned to whisper, "Mommy, why did that man's son take his house? Isn't that his son supposed to take care of him?" Her mother tried to hush her, embarrassed, but Diane, standing near the microphone, gently shook her head and said it was all right. The question hung there in the cold March air, simple and unbearable in its clarity, the kind of question only a child could ask without any of the softening language adults use to make cruelty sound complicated. Isn't that his son supposed to take care of him? I looked out at that little girl, and something in my chest loosened. That's the whole question, isn't it? I said into the microphone, my voice unsteady for the first time all morning. That's the only question that matters. Somewhere along the way, we all forgot to ask it out loud. I stepped down from that stage a few minutes later, and Chloe found me before I'd even reached the edge of the crowd. She didn't ask me why I hadn't warned her. She didn't ask me anything at all. She simply wrapped both arms around me right there in front of everyone and held on, and I held on to her. And for the second time in 3 weeks, I let myself be exactly as broken as I actually was in front of someone who loved me. "I'm so sorry, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry about all of it." "You have nothing to be sorry for," I told her. "You never did anything but love your grandmother and love me. That's the only part of any of this that was ever simple." We stood there for a while, and then I said something to her I had not planned to say, something that had been sitting underneath everything else for 3 weeks, unspoken, because I had been too busy being cold and precise to admit it even to myself. "I made a mistake with your father," I told her quietly. "Not the deed. The deed was right, but somewhere along the way, I gave him everything he asked for and never once made him earn a single thing he needed to actually become a man. I told myself I was being generous. I was really just being afraid that if I ever said no to him, he'd stop needing me at all. I don't know if that's why he turned out the way he did, but I know I never gave him the chance to find out what he could build with his own 2 hands instead of mine. I did that. Not your grandmother. Me. And I don't know how to undo 19 years of that in whatever time I've got left. I only know I'd like to try if he'll let me, and if he won't, I'd like to try with you instead, since you never asked me to prove any of this." Chloe pulled back and looked at me, and there were tears on her face, but she was nodding. "I'll let you," she said. "I've been letting you my whole life." The plaque was unveiled a short while later, a simple bronze marker reading the Eleanor Dostile Memorial Garden, and beneath it, a line Eleanor herself had once used in a speech to this same society, years before any of us knew we'd need it again. "Kindness that expects nothing back is the only kind worth planting." I stood with my hand on that bronze plate for a long moment, and I thought about the yellow kettle still sitting on the back burner of a house that, as of that morning, in front of 150 witnesses, everyone in this town now understood had never stopped being mine. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because the fallout from that morning did not resolve itself neatly or quickly, and I think the truth of it matters more than a tidy ending would. The Ferreros' attorney and Marcus worked together, cleanly and without malice, to unwind the fraudulent sale entirely, because the transaction had never been legally valid in the first place. My son had no fee simple interest to convey. The county recorder's office voided the deed transfer at Marcus's petition within about 6 weeks, and the title insurance company that had issued the Ferraros' policy, having missed the recorded life estate during underwriting, was contractually obligated to make the young couple whole, refunding their full purchase price plus a settlement for their trouble, and then pursuing its own claim against Gary separately to recover what it had paid out. My son did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because this is not a story about revenge dressed up as justice. The sale itself, once voided, left the Ferraros financially protected, and while the title company's fraud claim against Gary for the false sworn statement he'd signed at closing was serious and remains, as of the writing of this, still working its way through civil court, it was a financial reckoning, not a criminal one. I did not need my son in handcuffs to feel that the truth had finally been told. I only needed him to understand, once and for all, exactly what he had done, and to whom. There is one legal detail I want to explain plainly, because it matters and because I don't want to leave it vague. Some weeks after the garden dedication, once the dust from the voided sale had settled, Marcus drew up an amended trust document on my behalf, not a document that stripped Gary of some inheritance he'd never held, because, as we've established, he never held clear title to that house at all, and estate planning documents I control are entirely mine to write as I see fit. What that amended trust did was formalize, in writing, that upon my death, the Larkspur Lane property and the remainder of my estate would pass into a fund I was establishing in Eleanor's name. dedicated to legal aid for elderly homeowners, facing exactly the kind of exploitation I'd nearly suffered myself, with a much smaller, separate provision remaining for Gary and for Chloe both, structured so that Gary's portion would be held in trust and distributed gradually, contingent on demonstrated financial stability, rather than handed over outright the way his mother and I had always handed him everything before. I asked Gary to come in and sign an acknowledgement that he had been fully informed of these changes and would not contest them. He came alone. Renee, by then, had already filed for divorce and moved out of state, taking with her whatever she'd managed to set aside during that final secretive year of her marriage. My son sat across from me, and Marcus in a small conference room, looking older than I had ever seen him look, and he signed the acknowledgement without arguing a single point. Before he left that room, he asked if he could say something. I told him he could. "I used to think you were weak," he said, not looking at me, looking instead at his own hands folded on the table. "I used to think, after Mom died, when you went so quiet, I used to think that was it, that you were just going to fade away and let things happen to you, the way you always let things happen to you with me. I never once thought you were just watching, waiting. I don't know how to feel about a father who could do that to his own son." I sat with that for a moment before I answered him. "I wasn't waiting to punish you, Gary," I told him. "I was waiting to see if you'd ever, even once, choose honesty over convenience without someone forcing your hand. You didn't, not that day. Maybe someday you will, and if you do, I hope I'm still around to see it. But I couldn't keep handing you soft landings forever and calling it love. Your mother and I did that for 30 years, and look what it built." He didn't answer that. He nodded once, and he left, and I have not seen him since, except at a distance, twice, from across a courtroom gallery, during the title company's civil proceedings against him. I do not know, as I sit here telling you this story, whether my son will ever become the kind of man his mother always believed, somewhere underneath her worry that he still could be. I only know that I gave him 30 years of soft landings, and I gave him, in the end, exactly one hard truth, delivered in front of a garden planted in his mother's name. What he builds from that truth is no longer mine to control. It never really was. That, I think, is the last lesson buried in all of this. That you can control a piece of paper for 19 years, quietly, patiently, protecting what matters most. But you cannot control a person's character with a deed, no matter how carefully you file it. That part, every single time, has to be earned by the person living it, a year past the way years do after everything in your life has been rearranged at once, slowly at first, and then all at once, until you look up one afternoon and realize the ground beneath you has actually become solid again. I moved back into the house on Larkspur Lane that spring, once the title had been fully cleared and the Ferraros had been made whole and gone on to buy a different house across town, one with no complicated history attached to it at all. I walked back into that kitchen for the first time in nearly 4 months, and Eleanor's yellow kettle was still sitting on the back burner, exactly where she'd left it, because I had asked the moving company, weeks earlier, quietly, to make sure nothing from that kitchen ever left the property. I stood in the doorway the way I used to, and my hands did not shake. I made a full pot of coffee that morning, in my own kitchen, for the first time since my wife died, and I sat at our table and drank it slowly, and it did not feel like an ending. It felt, finally, like the beginning of something I could stand inside of without flinching. I want to tell you about the second thing that happened that spring, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story, more than the deed, more than the garden, more than the courtroom. Chloe finished her sophomore year and asked if she could spend the summer living with me on Larkspur Lane, instead of going back to her mother's empty apartment or her father's small rented place across town. I said yes before she'd finished the question, the way I'd said yes to Diane about the garden. She spent that summer doing something I never asked her to do and never expected. She took the ferns Eleanor used to hang every spring, found the exact same nursery Eleanor had bought them from for 30 years, and filled the porch with them herself, learning, cutting by cutting, how to keep them alive the way her grandmother had. In the evenings, she'd sit with me on that porch, And we'd talk about her classes, about her plans, about nothing important at all. And some nights we wouldn't talk much and would simply sit there together in the quiet, watching the porch light come on the way Eleanor always liked it. And it was, without question, the best summer of my life since the summer Gary was born. She asked me, one of those evenings, why I'd never told her father, all those years ago, that I still legally controlled the house. I thought about it for a long time before I answered, because I wanted to give her something true rather than something comfortable. I think some part of me always knew he'd need protecting from himself someday, I told her. Not because he was a bad man, because he was a man I'd never once made responsible for anything that truly mattered. And I was afraid of what that might turn into if the wrong person ever got close enough to take advantage of it. I was right to be afraid. I was wrong about almost everything else, about how to fix it, about what kindness actually means, about the difference between loving someone and simply making everything easy for them. But that one fear, I got right. I just wish I'd found a way to warn him instead of just quietly preparing for the day he'd need to be stopped. Chloe was quiet for a while, watching the porch light. Maybe some things can't be warned away, she finally said. Maybe some people have to hit the bottom before they can even hear the warning. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the year since she said it. I think my granddaughter, at 19, understood something about her own father that took me 63 years and the loss of my wife to finally learn myself. The Historical Society held another gathering that following autumn, a much quieter one, just a small dedication of a bench near the entrance of Eleanor's memorial garden, funded by the first modest disbursement from the legal aid fund we'd established in her name. By then, the fund had already helped 4 other families in the county, 3 widows and 1 widower, each of them facing some version of what had nearly happened to me, adult children moving too fast, too convenient, in the wake of a spouse's death, counting on grief to keep an old parent quiet long enough to finish the paperwork. Marcus handled 2 of those cases personally, pro bono, because he said watching what nearly happened to me had changed something in how he looked at every quiet, grieving client who walked through his door afterward. I sat on that bench the day it was dedicated, Chloe beside me, and Harold Weiss and Ruth Castellano and a dozen others from that first terrible morning gathered around. And there was no shouting this time, no public reckoning, no gasps rippling through a crowd. There was only the quiet, steady satisfaction of watching something good grow out of ground that had once held nothing but a stolen chair and a stranger's moving truck. I do not know what became of Renee, beyond the divorce filing and the state she moved to. And I have made my peace with not knowing. I know that Gary still lives in this county, still working through what remains of the civil judgment against him, and that Chloe sees him occasionally, on her own terms, at her own pace. And I have never once asked her to choose between us, because I decided a long time ago that I was done making my grandchildren carry the weight of choices that were never theirs to make in the first place. I think about that afternoon in the driveway sometimes, still more than I'd like to admit. The moving truck, the open car door chiming behind me, the sound of my son's voice telling me I didn't get to own anything anymore. 3 hours after I'd buried the only woman I ever loved, I used to think that moment was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I understand now that it was simply the moment I finally stopped being quiet in the way that had let it happen at all. If there is a single thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Grief does not make you weak, no matter how much it hollows you out, no matter how many mornings you stand frozen in a doorway, unable to reach the kettle on the back burner. Grief only makes you quiet. And there are people in this world, sometimes people who share your blood, who ate at your table, whose loans you co-signed and whose tuition you paid, who will read that quiet as permission. They will read it as weakness, as an invitation, as a closing window they need to climb through before it shuts. Do not let them convince you that the silence of your mourning is the same thing as the surrender of your rights, your dignity, or your home. Somewhere underneath even the deepest grief, keep one small steady part of yourself awake and watching. Keep your paperwork in order. Keep your own counsel a little longer than feels comfortable. And when the moment finally comes to speak, and it will come, sooner than you expect, dressed up as someone's convenience. Speak plainly, speak once, and let the truth do the rest of the work for you. I planted new ferns on that porch again, this spring. The same variety Eleanor always chose, the same nursery, the same care. Chloe helped me hang them on a Saturday morning in April, and when we finished, we sat together on the top step and watched the light change over Larkspur Lane, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as whole. My son sold my house and the same day I buried my wife. He never knew, in all those years, that the deed had never actually left my hands. But I think, if I'm honest, the real lesson was never about the paper at all. It was about learning, one painful year at a time, exactly what love is supposed to cost the people who receive it, and exactly what it costs, in the end, to give it away without ever once asking for anything back. If you've ever had to protect something you built with your own two hands from the very people you built it for, tell me in the comments. And if you believe the quiet ones are usually the ones still holding all the power, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's always another story where the paperwork tells the truth long after the people stopped bothering to.